Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's Learn at Lunch webinar. Today, we will hear from Dr. Lauren Cline, an assistant professor of agricultural leadership, as she discusses generational differences in the workplace. If you have questions during today's presentation, please ask them through the chat window, and Dr. Cline will answer them for you at the end of the webinar. Click the chat button at the bottom of the screen to open the chat window. Additional farm management resources may be found on the eFarm management page, and I will share this link through the chat window as well. Dr. Cline, I will turn it over to you now.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Ladd. I am excited to be with y'all this afternoon and appreciate y'all taking the time during lunch to pop in and perhaps learn a little different topic than what you may be used to in this webinar series. My background is in agricultural education and leadership. And so a lot of the things that I look at are kind of the people side of agriculture and how people interact with each other within the industry. One of those things that we look at is kind of multiculturalism. And multiculturalism can really be defined as a lot of different dimensions that make people different and similar to each other. And so for the purposes of today's webinar, I've been asked to talk to you a little bit about generational differences in the workplace. And you may be wondering, well, why do we need to know about this in the agricultural context? And the reason for that is that we have a lot of different generations that are working together. And sometimes we don't always stop and take the time to think about maybe the conflict that arises because of the different sets of values that these generations may have and the expectations that they have of each other. But then hopefully what we will learn through this webinar is also those unique strengths that different generations bring to the table and bring to different businesses and organizations, and how we can capitalize on that in our agricultural businesses. And so for today, a quick overview of what we'll be talking about. We're first going to define what are those different generations and what do we need to know about them. Then we're going to look at what are the differences that we see in the workplace when it comes to how the generations interact in the workplace, and then also what are the things they value in the workplace. And then we'll wrap up with some considerations for practice. And so some very practical things that I hope you can take away to do if you were perhaps in a workplace that has multiple generations working together. To kind of set the context for where we're going as well, I think the first thing we have to talk about is that in 2022, we are leading a more diverse workforce than we have ever experienced. And this is across any industry, any sector. We are seeing this. The workforce has diversified over the past several decades. And so because of that, one of the things that we see in workforce development, and we see this in agriculture as well, is that a lot of times we have this underlying assumption that when there are workplace conflicts happening or people are dissatisfied with the job, it's because there's differences between generations. I'm sure if I were to ask y'all to show your video, raise your hand, how many of y'all have heard things like, well, those young kids coming in, they just don't have good work ethic. Or maybe you remember being a new person in the workplace and saying, those old people, they just do not like change. And they think that we've got to do things the way it's always been done. Y'all have probably heard them. We have these assumptions about different generations, and we assume that that's what causes a lot of workplace conflict. Now, when we look at workforce trends for this year, so some of these trends came out in late December of 2021, as well as in January of 2022. We see that really some things that the workforce is concerned about for this next year are employee retention, the expectations that employees have about remote and hybrid work, a focus on skill development. So employees feeling like they are in a career where they're going to continue to learn versus just having a job that they're doing day in and day out. The development of soft skills, or like what I like to call leadership power skills, an emphasis on that continued employee growth and a match of company and personal values. And you may be wondering, what do these workforce trends have to do with us understanding generational differences in the workplace? Well, trust me, we're going to come back to that as we learn more about these generations, and in particular, the role and the changes that Generation Z is influencing in the workforce currently. And so with that, let's get started first on defining who these generations are. We are really in unprecedented times, and that for the first time in the history of civilization, we have 4 and sometimes 5 different generations working together in the same workplace. Now, when we look at our oldest generation, which would be our silent generation, in a lot of industries, people would say, well, they're retired. But in agriculture, I think we all probably are aware of maybe that older grandfather who still is farming, right? And is still a part of the family operation. And so again, that's something kind of unique to agriculture, and that sometimes there really are 5 generations all involved in the same operation or the same business. So that first generation that we still see is the silent generation, or sometimes you'll hear them referred to as the greatest generation. These are individuals who were born between 1928 and 1945. They're known for being very thrifty and frugal, because when we understand the context or the environment that they grew up in, a lot of these individuals either went through or were born post-depression and also experienced World War II as children. And so you have to think about, how did that impact them as individuals when they then entered the workplace? Well, these individuals, the silent generation, are very much known for putting their head down and working hard. They don't really want to bug the system. They're known for following the rules and working within the system as it's currently structured. We then move to our boomers. And so these are individuals that are born between 1946 and 1965. And for these individuals, understanding boomers' context of growing up, they lived through a lot of political instability, the Vietnam War, the Cold War, civil rights. They experienced a lot of reforms. They saw reforms in education, reforms in civil rights, and reforms in family structure. And so because of that, boomer generation is known as being probably one of the most influential generations that have ever existed. Now, for a lot of us, when we think of affluence, we think of financial affluence. I'm not saying that all boomers are financially affluent. What I mean by saying, and what research says when they say that boomers are affluent, is that they experience, compared to any other generation prior to them, have experienced more improved nutrition, higher literacy rates, better educational opportunities, and better intellectually stimulating environments. That has all led to them having a higher life expectancy than, again, any other generation before them. And so they have experienced just kind of this health affluence that didn't exist before. And then we have Gen X, the 3rd generation, born between 1965 and 1976. This generation was known as the latchkey generation. And so, kind of again, going back to the context of the boomers, this generation saw a lot of reforms in family structure. And so the parents of Gen X individuals oftentimes had families where both parents were working. And so that's how they kind of get dubbed the latchkey generation. We saw that there was reduced adult supervision or less attention to children. And then they also experienced the 1980s recession. A lot of this experience that they had in the 1980s, so thinking growing up after the Vietnam War, witnessing and kind of living post-Watergate scandal, Gen X is kind of generalizably known for being kind of ambivalent politically, but also cautious towards things like that. And so in the workplace, we kind of see them as savvy and skeptical, but also pretty self-reliant. And then we move into the millennials, which I will openly admit my bias here that I fall into this category myself. Millennials are born between 1977 and 1995. This is really the first generation to be considered a global generation, to have true connectivity all around the world, and to really view a perspective of things from that global perspective instead of just a localized perspective. For millennials, one thing that sometimes gets overlooked is that they did go through the Great Recession. So right about the time that millennials were starting to enter the workforce, the Great Recession occurred. And so for a lot of jobs that they had been looking towards having or had even been receiving education and training for were actually being lost due to technology. And so at the same time that we saw a lot of technological advancements, even in agriculture, we saw job loss for millennials in these areas. And so for them, the job market and just employment and workforce as a whole has been an area seen as being less stable. And so because of that, millennials tend to be known in the workplace as having high expectations, kind of combating that lack of stability that they feel they have. Interestingly enough, too, for millennials in the workplace, even though on paper it may appear that their salaries are higher than any other generation before, their actual ability to spend, their spending power is actually lower. And so for them, kind of raises in salary haven't necessarily kept up with prices of things or with inflation. And so that is something to consider too, understanding that context when we look at how they interact in the workplace. And then finally, we have our fifth generation, which are our Generation Z, or what's kind of being dubbed as Zoomers. I personally like this term Zoomers because I think for a lot of us, the past 2 years, we've been doing a lot of Zoom. And I know for me, I feel like my children aren't going to know any different than conferencing over the computer with Zoom. And so Zoomers are definitely this post 9/11 generation. It's crazy to think about, but I see it in my classes here at Oklahoma State very often that I have students who weren't even alive when September 11th happened, but they've grown up in this world that has been very much impacted by it. And so they're trying to figure out, where a lot of the caution and security is coming from. They also are the first generation to be considered digital natives. They have not known the world without the internet. And so that is very unique in and of itself. They're very diverse ethnically and racially compared to other generations. And again, they're used to this ease of access to information, and that's going to drastically change their expectations in the workplace. Another unique thing about Zoomers is that they're very values driven, and we'll get to some of those reasons why. I think it's important to also point out, what does the workforce look like? And this statistic is pretty reflective of the agriculture industry as a whole as well. We tend to think of Gen Z still as a new generation, but they actually already represent a quarter of those individuals in the workplace. If we put them and millennials together, they represent half of the workforce. And so it's important for us to really understand what these generations value if we want to understand how we can reduce perhaps some of the workplace conflict and challenges that we sometimes have. A question that I would kind of pose to you to kind of think about is, as the generational makeup of our workforce is changing, what in your particular context has changed to adapt to these generations? Or are we still kind of doing things as they've always been done? That's just kind of a rhetorical question I'd like you to mull over as we look at some of these differences. And so with that, we will dive into what exactly makes these generations different from each other, and how does this play out in the workplace? When we look at the workplace and how these generations approach their work and interact with their colleagues, we can see some differences as well as some similarities, or maybe how things kind of show themselves in different ways. Boomers, who still make up, quite a bit of the workforce, although many are retiring out, tend to approach their work in a very individualistic manner. But they're very engaged in work. To them, work defines a lot of what they do. And again, if you think back to the context that they grew up in and a lot of the reforms that boomers were a part of, work became a place where they really established their identity. The boomers are also the generation that in the workplace valued respect and appreciation of each other. So the boomer generation is known for creating a lot of the mechanisms that we see in workplaces today, where people are rewarded or given recognition for different things that they do, because the boomer generation felt that that was really important. Boomers are also known for their work ethic, and a lot of that is influenced by their parents, which came from the silent generation. In the workplace for Gen X, so those folks 1965 to 1976, Again, if you think about kind of the era and the context that they grew up in, it has informed their workplace habits to be much more pragmatic and skeptical. And so maybe you work with someone who's a part of this Gen X group and you can say, yep, I can see how they question things a lot, maybe seem a little bit ambivalent sometimes, but again, want to do things that are going to work and not necessarily always be idealistic. Because of this, sometimes they can seem less engaged in the workplace than their boomer colleagues. But the reason for that is they really want to approach work with much more balance between work-life balance sometimes than maybe their boomer parents did. They also want to work more independently. Our Gen Y or our millennials are a little bit different. So one thing to note is that Gen X and Gen Y or millennials both can be a product of the boomer generation, just because the boomer generation spans a long period of time. And so if you have a boomer generation that created a structure where respect and appreciation was really valued, then in the millennials, what you see as one of the consequences of that, and I'll let y'all determine if it's a good or bad consequence, is this idea that millennials tend to be very self-confident. I go back to the example that a lot of people will call the millennial generation the trophy generation, that they think everyone deserves a trophy for participation. While that may be true, they weren't the ones who created the trophy. So we have to be honest about that. The trophy was created by boomers. The millennials were the recipients of that. And that's what created that expectation. Millennials are also known for being very collaborative. What you're going to kind of notice here as we talk about the generations too is this rubber band effect, where one generation wants to kind of bounce back into the opposite thing that the generation before them did. So where they felt like Gen X colleagues maybe work very independently, millennials are going to tend to want to be more collaborative. They're also going to be the first generation in the workplace that starts to kind of have this social conscience of looking at the impacts that work has on the environment at large, whether that's their social environment or the actual physical environment. Millennials in the workplace also tend to be very innovative. They like ideas and coming up with new ways of doing things. And a lot of this has to do with the fact that they are that first global generation. And so they have a lot of exposure to different ways of doing things. And then finally, we end up with our Zoomers. These are our digital natives. And one thing I'll point out is that when I say Zoomers are digital natives, I'm not always saying that they're digitally literate. So those are two different things. It just means that they don't know a world without the internet. Zoomers, though, on the other hand, because they did experience some of the Great Recession, and I would even add to that now the pandemic, they tend to approach things in a very practical way. And so they're pretty similar to Gen X in some ways. They're also very diverse, and they also want to work independently. But one unique characteristic in the workplace about Zoomers is that they're very empathetic. And so because of that diversity, they tend to have more understanding for colleagues who do things a different way and understand kind of more the complexities that people bring to the workplace than just being focused on work. Values and how those look different among the generations is very important to think about in the workplace. A lot of times our behaviors are based on our values. And so when we look at conflict that occurs, a lot of times it's a conflict in values, not so much in people actually disliking each other or disagreeing on what an outcome needs to be. For boomers in the workplace, one of the things that they value the most is having a competitive environment and hard work. They also are very optimistic and they value having a work environment where people can work together as a team. Prosperity is a big value of theirs. Again, you think back to them being one of the most affluent generations that's ever existed. And so whether that's health prosperity, financial prosperity, that's oftentimes one of those end values for boomers. And then they also value individual choice. For Gen X, this generation is known for valuing independence, resourcefulness, transparency, adaptability, ethical decision-making, and then also being very direct. And I think that ties in with the idea of being transparent. Millennials have some other expectations based on their values. And one of the new values that we see pop up with this generation is the idea of providing feedback. Millennials, it's very important to them that a workplace value feedback and continual growth. They value achievement, which is a little bit different than competitiveness. Achievement has more to do with your own personal, like your competitiveness with yourself versus against someone else. They value collaboration. And again, they're kind of a difference between that and team working as a team is that collaboration is everyone truly having the opportunity to contribute to a new idea and a solution versus people just completing a task together. Millennials value technology. They also value family. And because of that, they value flexibility in the workplace. With Zoomers, we have seen that, again, this is kind of contrary to maybe some typical stereotypes we may have of this generation, but they actually value being very social, and they value the opportunity to appear to be entrepreneurial in the workplace. And so even if they are in a particular job where they aren't an entrepreneur, if they feel like they have the opportunity to really run with a new idea and see it to fruition, they're going to be satisfied. They value being able to be interactive, and they like to be able to multitask. Multitasking may freak some people out, but for Gen Zers, they prefer it. They also want to feel as if they are a philanthropist through their particular employment. And again, similar to even Gen Xers, they value being cautious. They don't want to make irrational decisions or even quick decisions. They want them to be thought out. And so you can see here that while there are some differences between the generations, you could probably also draw some similarities. And it's important for us to notice that oftentimes there's as many similarities as there are differences between generations. Focusing in though a little bit on Gen Z, since this is the new group in the workforce that we want to know more about. There's some key traits that we know from research that really defines Generation Z. The first trait we like to call phygital. And what this essentially means is that when Generation Z is entering workforces, or even, it could be a small business, it could be an agricultural operation, there is this automatic expectation that there's going to be sophisticated technology. Again, if we think back to the context in which they've grown up, Gen Z has not known a world without technology, let alone without the internet. And so if any of y'all have worked with someone that is considered Gen Z, I bet you've had an experience where they've talked about a new technology or asked, why don't we do things this way? Or have you used this particular software? They're just very up to date with what the newest and latest technology is, and they expect their workplaces to adopt those things. Along those same lines, Generation Z has grown up in a world where things have been able to be hyper customized. And so they really don't see a whole lot of siloing, and don't really think that that's an efficient way to do things. You'll also see them maybe push the boundaries a little bit more when it comes to job descriptions or what people are hired to do. They feel that everything should be able to be tailored and branded and personalized to what they want. One study that looked at this in particular with Generation Z found that 56% of Gen Zers want to be able to write their own job description. And the reason for that, if you think about the fact that they're very values driven, they want a job that is going to match up with their strengths and skills versus being in a job that maybe only hits on one or two of those things. They're going to encourage people to hire folks based on their skills and then create a job that matches their skills than trying to fit someone into a particular box of a business. And this may seem a little counterintuitive, but at the same time, Gen Z is known for being very realistic. They're very pragmatic minded. In higher education, one thing that we're seeing with Gen Z is there's not as much motivation to go to college. They don't seem as motivated by that, because if there's a way to go get training of some other kind that's going to get them to their desired outcome, they would rather do that. That seems much more pragmatic to them. They also are kind of characterized by this idea of FOMO. If you haven't heard that phrase before, it stands for fear of missing out. Again, always being connected and growing up with the internet, they are known for being on top of all the trends. This is one of their strengths that can really benefit any company, is that if you want to know how to reach new customers, if you want to know what the coolest new thing is for marketing, go to a Gen Zer. They'll let you know what that trend is. But one of the other sides to this that we have to think about is that they also then expect things to be just as fast paced. And so just as quickly as a trend might change, they're going to expect their organization, the business they work for, to adapt as quickly. And so if a company has a lot of bureaucracy, if there's a lot of red tape that has to happen before change can be enacted, that's going to frustrate a Gen Zer. They're also known as economists. And what we mean by that is that they have not known a world that exists that wasn't already a shared economy. So this idea where industries kind of break down borders and merge to create a new type of industry. If you think about things like Uber or Airbnb, just different ways of offering services that show to their skill development. So with knowing that they're very pragmatic, if they want to learn how to do something, they're going to learn how to do it. They're not going to wait for someone to teach them. They're not going to wait for a class to take. They're going to Google, find a video about it on YouTube, and learn how to do it. To them, that's the quicker, easiest, most pragmatic thing to do. And so they like that independent nature, have that independent nature, and want to have access to resources in that way. And again, our Generation Z in the workplace is known for being driven. 72% of Gen Zers consider themselves highly competitive. And I wonder if that's something that we are capitalizing off of in the workplace right now. And so here's what they oftentimes look like in the workplace. They're more cautious, they're more independent, but they're also very competitive. They're very tech savvy. Gen Zers expect authenticity and they want that feedback. They want to feel like they're continuing to grow. They want to maintain a boundary, though, between their professional and their personal lives. And so even though they've grown up with the internet and technology, they've maybe seen some of the negative consequences of having everything about their life available on the internet that maybe millennials didn't do so well. And so we see them creating more of a separation and barrier between those two things. They also want to work knowing that they're making a direct impact. They're constantly seeking new opportunities with organizations. And this is something that's a little bit different than even the millennial generation before them. They want to be committed to an organization. They don't want to career hop. They don't want to go from company to company, business to business. But they want to work for an organization that's going to invest back in them and provide them those continual opportunities for growth. And then finally, they look at breaking boundaries. And so they want an emphasis on skills and character oftentimes than professional appearance. I hear this a lot of times that Gen Z just appears way too casual, but yet they also have a really high standard for character in the workplace, morality in the workplace, and then also on that skill development and lifelong learning. And so what does all this mean? And what's the takeaway? What should we do with all this information about different generations? Well, first, I think for us that are working in agriculture, it can give us some insight on how to recruit Gen Z in agriculture. We know that there are more jobs available in agriculture than people to fill them. And so we've got to start thinking about, if this is already a quarter of the workforce, what can we do to recruit them into our jobs? I think the first thing that we can do a better job of is focusing on discussing our culture, our purpose, our values. Maybe in the past, when we talked about jobs, we would talk about salary and benefits that were available. And that recruited people in Gen X and even millennial generations. But for Gen Z, they want to hear more about the purpose. They want to know that they're going to make an impact with what is important to them. And so we want to highlight the purpose and values of our companies a little bit more. Also, because of their tech savviness, we probably need to highlight the role that STEM plays in agricultural careers a little bit more as well. We know it's there and we think it's pretty intuitive, but if you think of the number of Gen Zers that are going into computer science or engineering, we know that there's roles for those careers in agriculture. So we probably just need to make those connections more apparent. We also need to emphasize that the careers that we have provide opportunities to continue learning and to continue growing as an individual. Because we are constantly adopting new technologies and learning new scientific ways to do things, we need to emphasize that that's always going to be a part of what we do. We also want to look at how are we providing go-to resources that are easily accessible. Again, because of the DIY nature of Gen Zers, they're not going to want to wait for a professional development training to learn how to do something. And so are we making that professional development easily accessible to them that's kind of on demand when they want it? We want to make sure that we establish those feedback loops since feedback is really important to them. And we want to target communication about the skill development that they can continually receive in our industry. Another thing to think about as you look at, again, what do I do with this information, is to realize that generations have more in common than we often realize. I go back to even some of those workplace values. When we look at personal values between generations, research shows us that across generations, they all value family, integrity, achievement, love, competence, and happiness. But where these differences often are is how the different generations act on the values, not necessarily the values themselves. And so if you're experiencing, conflict in the workplace that appears to be because of how different generations are approaching things, if you can oftentimes get to the root of the value, you find that similarity and can work through those problems much easier. And similar to that, when we look at conflict in the workplace, a lot of times that generational conflict is most likely due to issues of control, power, and authority, rather than any actual real fundamental problem. And what I mean by that is that when a generation has had the control and the authority to make all the decisions in an organization, and then a new generation comes in and wants to shake things up a little bit, it can be intimidating, and it can also create kind of a defense mechanism. And if we realize that's what's going on and are able to work through it and realize that sharing power actually makes the organization better, we can work through that generational conflict and realize that there's not really a need to fear letting up some of that control and authority. And ultimately, it's important for us to talk about this and to understand how to work through generational conflict, because there's a lot of benefit to having many generations in the workplace. For one, we see an increase of empathy. When you have exposure to different people who are not like yourself, who think differently, who perhaps approach things from a different perspective, that is what builds our capacity to have empathy for others. And so we're creating a workforce that has more empathy. We also provide a unique opportunity for there to be reverse mentoring. And what I mean by that is that mentoring doesn't just have to be top down. It doesn't have to just be the old dogs teaching the new pups what to do. Mentoring can happen the other way. Old dogs, believe it or not, can learn new tricks. And so there's opportunities for the generations to learn from each other. And then finally, this diverse collaboration that can occur from having different generations work together is ultimately what's going to lead agricultural organizations and businesses into better problem solving and creating better solutions for a lot of the complex problems that we're experiencing in agricultural and natural resources. And so with that, I thank you so much for your time today, and I would love to answer any questions that you may have about generations in the workplace. And you can either unmute yourself if you have a question or type your question in the chat, whichever works best for you.
while people are thinking of questions and typing them or getting ready to ask them, I also will bring up another point related. We have a survey for this webinar, so you can tell us how we're doing and everything. And I shared the link to the survey in the chat window. So please help us out by filling that out and help us know how we're doing.
Oh, so Amy asked a great question. She said, how does this translate to ways we do extension outreach to meet multiple generation needs? This is a great question because I think, and I've heard it too in just some of the conversations that we were doing as far as strategic planning with extension, is this idea of what are the expectations when it comes to hybrid modes of extension programming. And I think what we have to realize is if we just go back to doing things the way we were doing before, we're probably missing out on an entire generation and how they expect to receive information. And perhaps the pandemic and providing more virtual learning opportunities actually increased us meeting the needs of Gen Z. I think that's just something for us to consider. I don't think it's a lot of the conversation that I've heard related to how programming has been offered is just, well, people want it for convenience. Well, for Gen Z, it's not about convenience. It's how they've been used to getting information their entire life. And so if extension hasn't been providing information to them in that way, then we shouldn't be surprised that we're not connecting with this younger generation. So I do think that we have to realize there's probably always going to have to be some hybrid component moving forward to the programming that we do. I also think it probably will also shift or should impact the conversations and how we present our information. Older generations have been very data driven. And again, Gen Z is much more values driven and impact driven. And so they want to see the difference that's being made by programming versus just data and statistics all the time. So we're seeing more of that social human component being discussed and being more important to this generation. Any other questions? Oh, this is a great question. Can you forecast what the next generation will be like as they grow up and begin to join the workforce? And what are they being called? So we're going back to the beginning of the alphabet with that generation. Right now they're being called Generation A. And, it's interesting, a lot of the literature right now that is just starting to kind of follow this generation is putting a lot of emphasis on the role that the pandemic is going to play for them. And so it's hard for me to forecast what things are going to look like. One thing that is seen later in the literature about Generation Z is this idea of when they're in the workplace, there does have to be more mentoring related to their communication skills. And so they may do well communicating by email, but they might not know how to do it in a professional way because a lot of their non-face-to-face communication by text or what have you is very informal. So there's kind of a relearning that has to occur with Gen Z. We also see it in research related to training Gen Z in like sales and marketing positions that oftentimes there has to be mentoring related to how to interact face-to-face. And so I do wonder if that's going to be something with Generation A that continues, is just as more things are done virtually, is there going to have to be more emphasis put on that face-to-face communication and what that looks like and what professionalism is.
Well, thank you, Dr. Cline, for presenting today, and thank you everyone for joining us. This is the last chance, last call for questions. So if you do have any questions, please ask them now, either unmute yourself or through the chat window. While you're thinking of any other questions, I will let everyone know that we have our next webinar scheduled for March 22nd. It's also Tuesday at noon. And Extension Ag economist Dr. Hannah Shear will discuss profit drivers in cow-calf production. So that's our next one coming up on March 22nd. So if there are no other questions, I'm going to say that is all for today. And until next time, goodbye.
Thank you all very much.